Mount Everest is often introduced with one simple claim: it is the highest mountain on Earth above sea level. That statement is true, but it hides a much richer story. Everest is known locally by different names: Sagarmatha in Nepal and Komalongma in Tibet, and those names remind us this mountain is not just a geographic feature. It exists inside living cultures, national identities, and political boundaries. Its summit lies on the border between Nepal and China, in the Mahalangur Himal section of the Greater Himalayan Range. So from the very start, Everest is both physical and symbolic. It is a place where geology, weather, ambition, and national pride intersect. In this video, we are not treating Everest like a postcard destination. We are treating it like a system, a mountain shaped by tectonic force, interpreted through measurement, and approached by humans willing to gamble everything for a few minutes on top. To understand Everest, you have to look beyond the summit photo and ask harder questions. How tall is it, really? Why is climbing it still deadly on routes that are considered standard? And what does it mean that more than 200 bodies remain on the mountain as permanent markers of ambition and risk? Let's begin with height, because even Everest's most famous number has changed with better science. In 2020, a joint Nepalese and Chinese survey established Everest's official elevation as 8,848.86 meters, or 29,031 feet and 8.5 inches. That precision is not cosmetic. It reflects advanced surveying methods and a diplomatic agreement between two neighboring states that both share the mountain. Height here is technical and political at the same time. People often assume a mountain's elevation is a fixed fact, but elevation depends on how you define sea level, what geodetic model you use, and how accurately you can measure through snow, ice, and atmospheric distortion. Everest's top is also not a static granite platform. Snow conditions can vary, and the Earth's crust itself is dynamic over long periods. So when we say Everest is 8,848.86 meters, we are describing the best current consensus, not an eternal unchanging truth. This matters because the mythology of Everest relies on absolutes. In reality, Everest's iconic number is the product of measurement systems, international cooperation, and modern geospatial science. The mountain may feel timeless, but our understanding of it continues to evolve. Another myth is that summiting Everest means climbing all 8,848 meters from sea level. Most climbers do nothing close to that. Everest's full elevation is measured from a geoid model approximating sea level, and the nearest sea to the summit is the Bay of Bengal, nearly 700 kilometers away. In practical terms, climbers start high, usually above 5,000 meters, because base camps are already deep in the mountains. On the Nepal side, many climbers fly into Kathmandu, continue to Lukla, then trek to South Base Camp before beginning the true ascent phases. Even from Lukla, the total elevation gain to summit is roughly 6,000 meters, not nearly 9,000. On the Tibetan side, access to North Base Camp is often reached by vehicle, changing the effort profile before the climb even starts. This does not make Everest easier. It makes it different from the popular imagination. The challenge is less about one continuous giant climb and more about surviving in thin air while repeatedly moving up and down to acclimatize, carrying fatigue across weeks, and preserving enough strength for a narrow summit window. Everest is a campaign, not a sprint, and misunderstanding that leads to dangerous assumptions. When people hear that Everest's standard route is not highly technical compared with extreme rock or mixed alpine lines, they sometimes misread that as safe. It is not safe. The core dangers of Everest are systemic rather than flashy: altitude sickness, severe weather shifts, high winds, objective hazards like avalanches, and unstable terrain such as the Khumbu icefall. At extreme elevation, your body is slowly shutting down. Decision-making degrades, recovery slows, and simple movements demand disproportionate energy. Add wind chill, route congestion, and the pressure of turning around before oxygen runs out, and even routine choices can become life or death. The mountain does not need vertical overhangs to kill people. It only needs time, cold, and low oxygen. A climber can be strong, skilled, and still lose because Everest punishes small errors brutally. Calling the route standard can be technically accurate in mountaineering terms, but for general audiences it creates false confidence. On Everest, the absence of advanced technical moves does not mean the absence of extreme risk. It means the risk comes from environment, physiology, and exposure that cannot be negotiated once conditions collapse. The human cost makes this reality impossible to ignore. By May 2024, 340 people had died on Everest. More than 200 bodies remain on the mountain, not because no one cares, but because recovery itself can be extraordinarily dangerous. At those altitudes, every extra task consumes oxygen, time, and strength that rescuers may not have. Moving a body over steep ice and fixed ropes in the death zone can place multiple living climbers at lethal risk. So the mountain holds its dead in plain sight, and that changes the psychology of everyone who climbs it. This is one of Everest's harshest ethical dimensions. The summit is celebrated globally, while the logistics of death are handled quietly by teams who bear disproportionate danger and emotional burden. These numbers also challenge a simplistic hero narrative. Everest is not just a test of courage, it is a test of judgment. The difference between a successful expedition and a fatal one can be weather timing, turnaround discipline, oxygen management, or simply being in the wrong place when seracs collapse. Statistics alone do not tell individual stories, but they make one thing clear: Everest remains unforgiving, even in the modern era. Historically, Everest became a proving ground long before modern commercial expeditions. Early recorded summit attempts came from British teams approaching from Tibet, because Nepal was closed to foreign entry at the time. In 1921, British reconnaissance reached around 7,000 meters on the North Col, establishing critical route knowledge in a largely unknown high-altitude environment. Then in 1922, climbers pushed above 8,000 meters for the first time in human history and reached 8,321 meters on the North Ridge route. That achievement is easy to overlook today, but at the time it redefined what humans thought physically possible. Remember, this was done with early equipment, limited weather forecasting, and far less understanding of altitude physiology than we have now. These expeditions were not just athletic events, they were experiments conducted at the edge of survival. Every meter gained supplied data for future teams, but also extracted a cost in risk and tragedy. If you strip away imperial framing in national competition, what remains is a stark pattern. Everest was mapped and approached through repeated exposure to extreme uncertainty. Modern climbers inherit both that knowledge and that danger. No chapter of Everest history is more debated than the 1924 disappearance of George Mallory and Andrew Irvine. On June 8, they launched a final summit attempt and never returned. That uncertainty created one of mountaineering's longest-running questions: did they reach the top before they died? The debate matters because it sits at the intersection of evidence and myth. If they summit, they would predate the first documented ascent by decades. But documentation is the key word. Mountaineering history relies on verifiable proof, not legend, and in high-risk environments evidence can vanish with a storm, a fall, or a lost camera. So Mallory and Irvine became symbols of something larger than a single claim. They represent the human drive to push into unknown limits with incomplete tools and incomplete certainty. Their story also reveals how Everest can absorb people into narrative almost as powerfully as it absorbs them into ice. Whether they stood on the summit or not, their final climb shaped public imagination and intensified the idea of Everest as the ultimate unfinished question. On this mountain, not all achievements can be conclusively measured, and not all mysteries can be resolved. The first documented summit came in 1953, when Tenzing Norgay and Edmund Hillary reached the top via the southeast ridge. Documented matters here because their success entered the historical record with clear expedition evidence and broad acceptance. But this milestone did not emerge from nowhere. Norgay had already climbed to 8,595 meters the previous year during a Swiss expedition, showing how progress on Everest is often cumulative across teens and seasons. Each expedition leaves route intelligence, physiological lessons, and tactical refinements for the next. The 1953 ascent is rightly iconic, yet it should also be understood as part of a chain of effort, not a sudden miracle. It represented planning, partnership, and decision-making under severe pressure. It also reshaped Everest's global image from impossible prize to achievable objective, at least for a narrow group with resources, support, and experience. That shift had huge consequences: more attempts, more infrastructure, and eventually a commercial ecosystem around the mountain. The Hillary and Norgay ascent is therefore both a triumph and a turning point. It opened a door that could never be closed again. Everest history is also plural, and the north side has its own landmark. On May 25, 1960, a Chinese team consisting of Wang Fuzhou, Ganpo, and Chu Inawa reported the first ascent from the North Ridge. This was geopolitically significant and mountaineering significant at once, because it validated the viability of a major alternative approach to the summit. The two principal routes, from the southeast in Nepal and the north in Tibet, are not just directional options. They reflect different logistics, terrain profiles, weather exposure patterns, and state systems of access. Route choice can influence acclimatization strategy, bottleneck timing, and objective hazards encountered during summit pushes. For audiences outside climbing culture, it can be tempting to view these as equivalent roads to the same endpoint. In reality, each side has its own operational rhythm, constraints, and risk signatures. By recognizing major achievements from both sides, we get a fuller and more accurate Everest history, one that is less centered on a single national narrative and more grounded in the mountain's shared, contested, and deeply international character. One of the most underappreciated aspects of Everest is acclimatization, the slow physiological adaptation to low oxygen. Climbers cannot simply arrive at base camp and go for the summit. They typically follow staged rotations: climb higher, return lower, rest, then repeat. This strategy helps the body adjust, but it also drains energy over time and exposes climbers repeatedly to hazards like icefall crossings and storm windows. In simple terms, success on Everest often means spending weeks getting weaker more slowly than the mountain is trying to weaken you. That is why logistics, pacing, and discipline matter as much as raw fitness. Turning around near the summit can be the smartest decision of an expedition, yet psychologically it feels like failure after massive investment. This is where Everest reveals a brutal mental game. Climbers fight not only terrain, but sunk cost pressure, ego, team dynamics, and timing uncertainty. The mountain rewards patience and punishes haste, but summit weather windows are narrow and opportunities rare. The paradox is stark: to reach the top, you must resist the very urgency that pushed you there. Everest also forces uncomfortable questions about responsibility and storytelling. Popular media often spotlights individual determination, but every summit depends on larger systems: route fixing, camp setup, load carrying, weather interpretation, and rescue response. The mountain's risk is distributed unevenly, while recognition is often distributed selectively. Even without introducing facts beyond this article, we can see the pattern in outcomes. High death totals, unrecovered bodies, and repeated hazard exposure make clear that Everest is not simply an arena for personal glory. It is a place where collective labor and collective risk sustain individual achievement. That does not invalidate summit dreams, it contextualizes them. A mature view of Everest holds two truths at once: climbing it can be a profound human accomplishment, and pursuing it can create moral trade-offs that cannot be edited out of the final photo. If we only celebrate the top, we miss the mountain. If we only count fatalities, we miss why people keep returning. Everest persists as a global fixation because it compresses ambition, mortality, and meaning into one vertical landscape. So what is the real story of Mount Everest? It is the highest mountain above sea level, yes, but also a measured number refined by science and diplomacy. It is a climb most people start high above sea level, yet still one of the hardest endurance tests on Earth. It is historically rich, from early British reconnaissance to unresolved mysteries, documented breakthroughs, and major ascents from both south and north. And it is dangerous in ways that cannot be reduced to technical grade alone: thin air, violent weather, avalanche terrain, and irreversible consequences. Everest endures because it sits at the limit of what humans can organize, endure, and justify. It asks not only whether you can climb higher, but whether you can decide well when everything in you wants to keep going. In that sense, Everest is less a single mountain and more a mirror. It reflects our precision and our uncertainty, our discipline and our obsession, our triumphs and our losses. The summit is only the visible point. The deeper story is everything it takes, and everything it costs, to stand there. If you found this helpful, please like this video and subscribe for more explainers.